Our world consists of nation-states, but these were created beginning in the 1700s. Most current nation-states came into existence in the 1800s and 1900s, often through revolutions such as those discussed in Chapter 16, and they relied on ideas of nationalism in their formation. Further, nationalism permeates most concepts of identity and political ideology that we rely on today. Indeed, this is so much the case that we often take the perspective of nationalism as a natural way or the only way to understand how individuals and societies exist. But like all ideas, nationalism is made up. And in addition to creating new nation states, the emergence of nationalism as a way of seeing the world constitutes an intellectual revolution. This isn't just about the creation of nation states and a new worldview. This process has relied on historical knowledge to achieve the creation of both nation states and the worldview. History, far more than any other body of knowledge, has fueled this trend for two reasons. First, it has satisfied our need to connect with ancestors, even as we are creating something new and completely separate from those ancestors. Second, it has applied the prestige and authority of historical depth to institutions and ideas that lack historical depth. Serving both of these reasons, however, has required people to contort and even distort our knowledge of the past to create national and nationalist histories that justify the creation of the nation state and that justify allegiance to that nation state. Because nation states now dominate the political organization of our world, national histories have come to dominate our study of the past. This lecture looks at how this process developed and raises questions about how we should perceive national histories in our globalizing world. We can get an understanding of the ideas behind the nation state and nationalism by contemplating some of the meanings that we attach to our use of the words nation, nation state, and nationalism. This definition is interesting because it presents the idea of people, quote, united by factors such as common descent, language, culture, history, or occupation of the same territory, unquote, as though such a thing actually exists. What we find when we study the history of nations is that people have put a great deal of effort into modifying these features of nationality to create a sense of unity. Let's take language as a quick example. Many of the languages that we associate with nations and nationalities today are really inventions of standardization through which diverse dialects were suppressed or transformed to become standard languages that were considered correct, proper, or prestigious. This standardization was achieved through public schools, which required that students speak and write correctly rather than how they communicated at home, which was considered a broken form of the national language. Standardization was also achieved through laws and social pressure, in which people were punished for speaking their traditional dialects or for using completely different minority languages. After all, the use of deviant forms of language would undermine the unity of the nation, which demanded homogeneity, even if the actual people were not homogeneous. While some may regard this position as common sense, it isn't. Remember, most people throughout most of the human past have been multilingual, so this idea of monolingualism for individuals or societies is not part of human nature, nor is it required to have a peaceful and prosperous society. We have way too much human history that shows us otherwise. Instead, we have to see the concept of beneficial monolingualism as a feature of a specific ideology that serves a specific purpose. In our world, that ideology and purpose has been nationalism. Okay, we move on to nation state, which reflects the same ideas seen in the term nation. Again, almost no nation state in existence today has such a simple history that what is said to be shared or common is not the product of long, difficult struggles over heritage and history. We have moved around and mixed cultures and DNA too much for any society to be truly homogeneous, even in places that we perceive as ancient homelands for certain ethnicities or nationalities. Now we can get to nationalism itself. This is a good one because it focuses on consciousness, which does not assume a commonality, but instead emphasizes the perception of commonality. And this is where ideas of the nation and nationalism have been most effective. In many instances, the efforts to make diverse populations homogeneous have failed, though they have had big impacts. But even if the population of a nation is not homogeneous, people can feel a common identity based on any number of ideas. Thus, they can constitute a nation based on their sense of allegiance to the state and to each other. But this often goes to another level beyond feeling a shared identity with others within a nation state. It can also become a sense of superiority or exceptionality that separates one nationality from all other nationalities. Nationalism doesn't have to lead to this, but it often has, often with very negative results. While people haven't needed nationalism to be motivated to make wars, commit genocide, or to generally oppress other people, nationalism has played a distressingly significant role in justifying or inspiring wars, genocide, and oppression in the past 2 centuries. We have to realize that nationalism has been a cover or just another way to express other perceptions such as racism, ethnocentrism, and sexism, all of which are far older than nationalism, of course. But we also can't ignore the fact that people have consistently chosen to promote or express their racism, ethnocentrism, and sexism through nationalism. So, nationalism has introduced something new to the equation of politics and violence that has extended our older weaknesses with intolerance and fears of difference. Further, we could say that nationalism has allowed some people to repackage perspectives that may be no longer socially acceptable or seen as up to date. In examples like this, it is possible to cloak racist and ethnocentric ideas about some people by claiming an interest in securing the integrity of national borders or preserving rights and privileges of citizens from parasitic outsiders. Of course, we have plenty of examples in which certain nations had absolutely no problem in coupling and openly expressing their nationalism, racism, ethnocentrism, and sexism, which was far too common in the 19th century in Europe and the United States, as these societies developed their new nation states and global empires. Despite the very real negative aspects, nationalisms have been developed and used for very different purposes. Among the earliest were what we could call liberal nationalisms, in which people created nation states that claimed to recognize the freedoms of individuals, as seen in the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. We also see forms of nationalism that were created to consolidate power in the effort to resist external threats, particularly European imperialism. One of the best examples of this was Ethiopia, which blended older ideas about political authority with European-derived expressions of nationalism to assert Ethiopia's place as a legitimate nation among nations in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Another kind of nationalism was imperial nationalism, in which one nation-state built its identity around the expansion of its political and economic control of other people and places. We see this in several empires, most notably the British, French, and Japanese empires. We also situate in the realm of nationalism the struggles to extricate colonized people and places from empires. This anti-colonial nationalism was quite prevalent in the 20th century, as many in Asia and Africa created nationalist identities to assert and achieve their independence from the European empires, largely in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. A big part of all these forms of nationalism has been the invention of a history for the nation. I don't mean this to say that national histories are collections of made-up people and events. This has happened, of course, but even without pure fabrications, we have to recognize that the information included in national histories may have been real, but the relationship of the nation-state and its citizens to those historical people and events had to be made up. The past, no matter how distant or disconnected from the present, had to be portrayed as contributing in a direct linear way to the emergence of the nation-state. This meant that certain glorious parts of the past were amplified, other parts were remembered in new ways, and some parts were intentionally forgotten because they did not fit the narrative of the national history. In many cases, the hardest part of creating national histories was getting rid of the burden of the recent past, especially if that recent past seemed contradictory to ideologies and intellectual currents that were prevalent at the time. This takes us to the examples of Greek and Turkish nationalism that emerged from the gradual decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th century. As we've encountered in our textbook reading from chapter 19, the Ottoman Empire changed a lot in the 19th century. In short, the Ottoman Empire went from being the glorious sword of Islam to the sick man of Europe. As this transformation occurred, people in places that were part of the Ottoman Empire embraced their own forms of nationalism. We will look at the people and places that became the modern nation-states of Greece and Turkey to see the interesting ways that the creation of nationalist histories contributed to this process. Both the modern nation states of Greece and Turkey were made from the Ottoman Empire, and they created very different ties to the distant past to support their nationalisms, even though they shared a recent past as parts of the Ottoman Empire. But during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire seemed to embody the death of the old political order as non-European, non-industrial empires faded while Western industrialized states and empires became world powers. The birth of Greek nationalist history presents an interesting example because it developed outside of Greece in the Ottoman Empire and in conjunction with Enlightenment Europe's fascination with classical Greece. Remember that many Enlightenment intellectuals in Europe resurrected ancient Greece as a source of inspiration and ideas to give Europe and its new intellectual and political movements historical depth. This memory of and connection to ancient Greece was highly selective and basically turned all the ancient Greeks into philosophers made of white marble. Very noble and elegant, but devoid of the complexity and messy humanity that ancient Greece really was. Well, a number of Greek intellectuals who lived in Europe outside of the Ottoman Empire embraced this idealization too. These Greek intellectuals went the next step, though, in connecting ancient Greece to modern Greek-speaking people. They were creating a history of the modern Greek people that affirmed their right to rule themselves and throw off the yoke of Ottoman rule. A big historical question that had to be resolved in this emerging Greek nationalist history and in the European Enlightenment view of the ties to ancient Greece was to explain why Greeks in the present had failed to maintain their intellectual and cultural ties to their glorious ancient Greek ancestors. How could the descendants of the ancient Greeks fall so low as to be dominated by a backward Islamic and Asian people such as the Ottomans? This oversimplified the histories of the Greeks and the Ottomans, of course, but the fundamental issue remained. Much had changed between the glory days of ancient Greece and the apex of Ottoman power. History was supposed to be the story of progress in Enlightenment thought, and this definitely did not fit a Eurocentric model of world history. For some European Enlightenment thinkers, the answer was simple. People in Ottoman Greece were not descendants of the ancient Greeks. They were descendants of Slavic and Albanian people who replaced the original Greeks during the Byzantine era that flourished after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the rise of the Ottomans. This would seem to explain the supposed failure of modern Greeks to live up to the example of the ancient Greeks. They weren't the same people. This was interesting because it allowed some European Enlightenment intellectuals to state that there weren't any biological descendants of the ancient Greeks, so they, European Enlightenment intellectuals and their vision of modern European civilization, were the legitimate inheritors of the ancient Greek legacy. Needless to say, this is where Greek nationalist intellectuals departed from some of their European Enlightenment colleagues. As Greeks and intellectuals, they claimed both a biological and intellectual connection to the ancient Greeks and saw the necessity of reclaiming this link for modern Greeks struggling under Ottoman domination and for training the Greek elite who would lead the new nation. But they also extended the notion of who was Greek by including certain desirable communities of Greek-speaking people regardless of their early ethnic associations. This was the case because many within the Ottoman Empire came from diverse cultural backgrounds, but they could gain a higher social status by becoming Greek, which basically meant becoming Greek speakers and gaining social prestige through certain professions and living in cities. So the Greek people included an interesting array of people within and outside the Ottoman Empire, and their shared history was centered on their connection to the ancient Greeks. This idea came to fruition in independent Greece as the University of Athens in the 1830s and 40s offered ancient Greek history as their only classes in Greek history, thus ignoring the most recent 1500 years of the Greek past. For most of the people of modern Greece, however, ancient Greece held little allure. It was pre-Christian and distant. Greek-speaking people were Orthodox Christians as their ancestors had been for 1500 years under both the Byzantines and Ottomans. This mattered to folks, so the nationalist histories had to be revised to include the Orthodox Christian past too. While our understanding of the Byzantine Empire demonstrates that this Christian state was very hostile to so-called pagan culture and knowledge and sought to suppress and even destroy its students and institutions, New Nationalist histories propose two contradictory views. One was that the Byzantine era involved a blending of the ancient pre-Christian civilization and the Orthodox Byzantine world. So we see continuity with ancient Greece and Byzantine Christian Empire in this reworking of the past. But another rejected the Byzantines as Eastern, meaning Asian, despots who suppressed Greek culture and true Orthodox Christianity. According to this last view, it was within Orthodox Christianity that classical Greek language and identity was preserved despite the destructive nature of the wicked Asian Byzantine state. This last view of the past gained credence in the 19th century for one big reason. Greek nationalists depended on Western European states for support against the Ottomans. The Byzantines were antagonistic to Western Roman Catholic Christians. The feeling was mutual, and so they were seen as enemies of the West. That was fine back in Byzantine days 1,000 years ago, but in the 1800s, when Greek nationalists fought a war against the Ottomans in the 1820s and struggled to build a new nation-state in the midst of big empires duking it out in the Mediterranean, they needed Western allies. So an affinity for the West was seen as an alliance with the modern world and a political and military necessity. They also noted, like European Enlightenment intellectuals, that the West was the child of ancient Greece. So they could claim a deep tie to the West, which was now the source for rising global powers such as Great Britain and France. So Greek nationalists revised their nationalist history to include both ancient Greece and the connections to the West as fundamental elements of their past and future. What was missing from this nationalist creation of history? The Ottoman Empire. Some nationalists gave credit to the, quote, bloodthirsty sword of Muhammad, unquote, wielded by the Ottomans for destroying the anti-West Byzantines, but the Ottomans were seen essentially as oppressive tyrants whose rule corrupted Greek culture and identity. The nearly 4 centuries when Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire was not Greek national history, even though the place and people that became the nation-state of Greece were in the Ottoman Empire for many generations, and their ancestries and cultures reflected this past. During this same time as Greek national history was being formed and refined, a strangely similar process was happening within other realms of the Ottoman Empire. As we know from our textbook readings, many leaders of the Ottoman Empire turned to Western European states for ideas and instruction in reforming numerous aspects of the government, military, and social institutions. This may seem paradoxical if we think solely in terms of the Islamic Ottoman Empire in conflict with Christian Western Europe during the 1800s. But remember that the Ottoman Empire fought both against and in alliance with Western European states in various wars during the 1800s. So a simple Muslim versus Christian or East versus West idea does not hold up, and its leadership very deliberately attempted to emulate the trends exemplified by Western European states. One of the trends that gained ground in the late 19th century was Turkish nationalism. While the Ottoman Empire was at its core an empire founded and governed by Turkish people, it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, geographically expansive state at its greatest extent, though this was reduced as the empire shrank during the 1800s. Turkish nationalism embraced a vision of the future of the homelands of the Ottoman Empire that did not include the empire. When the empire finally dissolved after World War I, the modern nation of Turkey emerged as the culmination of this nationalist movement. What concerns us here is not the history of that nation, but the creation of history by Turkish nationalists to support the existence of a Turkish, not Ottoman, nation. Key to this Turkish nationalist history was the rejection of the Ottoman Empire. According to this nationalist history, the Turks as a cultural and biological entity existed before the first civilizations and were the founders of the great civilizations of Central and Western Asia. This gave Turkish nationalists an ancient past for the Turkish people and a place within world civilization that then justified the existence of the Turkish nation in the present, which in this instance was the late 19th and early 20th century. Further, this history was not only pre-Ottoman but also pre-Islamic. What did these ideas mean in this period of empire and nationalism? It meant that the Turks deserved their own nation state, This nation state derived from a heritage that exceeded the historical status claimed by European states, and the prevalence of Islam among Turks did not exclude a Turkish nation from its proper role as a modern nation state in a world dominated by non-Islamic European nation states. A dying Ottoman Empire inherently contradicted this vision for a Turkish nation state, so the national history created before Turkey was founded and then propagated in Turkish schools after the founding of the Republic dismissed the Ottoman Empire as an aberrant interlude between the glorious Turkish past and the creation of the Turkish nation state. What is so interesting here is that the nationalist histories of both the Greek nation-state and later the Turkish nation-state required the exclusion of the Ottoman Empire as a source of historical identity. Both engaged in denying the Ottoman past, even though the Ottoman Empire was the crucible in which the people and cultures of both nation-states had been shaped for centuries. But this reflects the nature of nationalism and nationalist histories. Knowledge of the past serves to justify the existence of the nation-state. We have to ask, is this a sound way to create history? Can we trust national histories? Should we be satisfied with or even supportive of histories created primarily to serve purposes in the present? We do have to ask these questions because we live in a nation state with its own national history that has been created through similar processes as the Greek and Turkish national histories discussed here. We have also been exposed to this national history through schools and holidays and other methods of creating a national culture. Are we deceived or enlightened by this? This also takes us back to something we addressed at the beginning of the course. The interpretive lens of world history compels us to understand the past in a context much bigger than national histories ever could. As we live in an increasingly globalizing world, it seems that our understanding of the past needs to grow as well.